My name is Mallory Hendricks. I'm 34 years old, and I never imagined the most serious threat to my financial future would reach me through a screen door on a Saturday morning when all I came to pick up was a folder of old tax returns. I've worked as a corporate paralegal at a law firm in Atlanta for 9 years, long enough to understand what can happen when property ownership gets tangled up with family loyalty. Long enough to recognize, the moment I heard my father's voice through that screen door, exactly what kind of situation I was stepping into. But I need to go back a little first. I grew up in Decatur, Georgia, the oldest of 2 kids. My father spent his whole career as a district manager for a regional grocery chain, and my mother worked part-time at the elementary school down the block from our house. They were good people who worked hard, saved modestly, and believed deeply that family was supposed to move together, as a unit, covering each other's gaps without being asked. That value was never spoken out loud. It was just understood. You didn't wait to be called. You showed up. I absorbed that without questioning it for most of my 20s. I finished my associate's degree, got certified as a paralegal, and landed a position at a small firm that eventually grew into something solid. By the time I turned 27, I was making enough to think seriously about buying property. Atlanta's market was moving fast. If I waited, I'd be priced out of the neighborhoods I actually wanted to live in. My parents offered to help with the down payment, $18,000. Almost everything they'd managed to save beyond their retirement. My father framed it as a family investment. I remember his exact words: "We put in, you build equity, and someday that house helps all of us." I was grateful. I didn't think to ask what helps all of us meant in specific legal terms. I was 27, and I trusted my father's intentions. We signed the deed together, and I started paying the mortgage the following month. That was 7 years ago. The property is a duplex in East Point, just southwest of the city. I live in the upper unit and rent the lower one. The rental income covers about half the mortgage. I cover the rest, plus insurance, maintenance, and every repair bill that has come through in 7 years. A new water heater in year 3. A section of roof that needed patching after a bad storm the following winter. A full plumbing inspection when the downstairs tenant reported low pressure. I handled all of it. My parents' contribution was the down payment that got me to the closing table. Everything after that was mine alone. My brother Seth is 5 years younger than me. He's always been the one the family excused without quite realizing they were doing it. Not because he's lazy, he genuinely isn't, but because he's the kind of person who chases ideas with real enthusiasm, right up until the moment an idea stops feeling exciting. When we were kids, my parents called that creativity. As we got older, they started calling it entrepreneurial spirit. His first real venture was a food blog. He put serious effort into it for almost 8 months before the audience never materialized and he moved on. After that came a dropshipping business selling specialty kitchen tools, which collapsed after a supplier dispute. Then a brief partnership in a screen printing operation that lasted 2 seasons. My parents funded each attempt in small ways, a few $100s here, 1,000 there, and each time things unraveled, they framed it as tuition, experience, not failure. I never criticized Seth to my parents. Whatever I privately believed about his follow-through, he was my brother and I genuinely wanted him to find something that stuck. I said that often enough that I think it became part of how my family understood me. Mallory is supportive. Mallory is stable. Mallory handles her own life and never asks anyone to carry her weight. What I didn't fully appreciate, until a Saturday in April, was how completely that reputation had stopped being a compliment. It had rained that morning. One of those warm Georgia spring rains that clears fast and leaves the air smelling like wet pine. I drove to my parents' house to pick up a folder of tax documents from 2019 and 2020, records I'd stored there years ago when I was between apartments and that I now needed for a refinancing application. I texted my mother that I was coming. She responded with a thumbs up, completely ordinary. Their house is a single-story ranch in Decatur, the same one I grew up in. I almost always come through the side gate and enter from the back because the front door swells in humid weather and nobody uses it anymore. I came up the back path, and as I reached the steps to the screened porch, I heard my father's voice through the door before I had a chance to knock. He was talking to Seth. I could tell from Seth's lower, less certain voice asking questions, while my father answered with the calm confidence of someone who has already worked through every angle on his own. I heard my father say that the duplex had significant equity now. He said that both his name and my mother's name were still on the deed. He said that under the current property value, their ownership position could help Seth qualify for an SBA loan to open the wing restaurant he had been planning for the past several months. All Seth needed was for them to submit a letter to the lender, confirming their support, and to list the property as part of the collateral structure. Seth asked a question I couldn't fully make out, and my father said, "Clear as anything. Mallory will be fine with it, she always is." I didn't move. I stood on the back steps with my hand an inch from the screen door handle, and I didn't move for what felt like a very long time. The folder of tax documents was still tucked under my arm. I could hear the neighbor's lawnmower somewhere 2 yards over. A bird was in the magnolia tree beside the fence. I did not open the door. I went back down the path, got in my car, and drove home. Here is what I understood before I even reached the expressway. My parents' names being on the deed was not just a formality. In Georgia, co-owners on a deed have real legal standing. If they contributed their ownership interest to a loan application, or offered their positions as part of a collateral structure, the property I had been paying for every single month for 7 years could become entangled in a business I had no stake in and no ability to control. If Seth's restaurant failed, and I had watched him walk away from 4 ventures in a row, a lender could pursue the collateral. Property liens don't stay neatly within one person's ownership share. They follow the asset. I also knew something else, something I hadn't fully confronted before that moment. My parents didn't have other significant assets to offer. Their own home still had a mortgage on it. The retirement accounts were off limits. The $18,000 they'd contributed to the duplex in 2017 was in many ways the best financial position they had. So they weren't being irresponsible with someone else's resource. In their minds, they were offering what was genuinely theirs to offer. The problem was that what was genuinely theirs was also deeply intertwined with what was mine. 7 years of mortgage payments are worth something. They had just decided not to factor that in. I had spent 9 years sitting beside attorneys while they untangled exactly this kind of situation for other families. I knew what came next if I did nothing. That evening I called a colleague I trusted completely, a real estate attorney at my firm named Pauline. I apologized for reaching her on a Saturday night. She told me not to apologize and to start from the beginning. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I already half knew but needed to hear from someone else. Waiting to see what happened would be the wrong move. My parents' names on the deed meant they had legal standing to act, and a letter from co-owners to an SBA lender was not nothing. If a loan was approved before I raised a formal objection, untangling it afterward would take far longer than getting ahead of it now. She told me I had 2 options. I could file a partition action, which would be expensive and slow, and almost certainly damaging to every family relationship I had. Or I could make my parents a formal buyout offer at fair market value for their share of the property, get a quitclaim deed transferring their interest to me, and clear the title into my name alone, before any loan application moved any further forward. The duplex had been appraised at $282,000 the previous fall. Pauline estimated a fair market buyout in the low to mid-20s, depending on how the equity calculation worked out against the original contribution. I asked her to start preparing the offer letter on Monday. I did not sleep particularly well that night, but not because I was uncertain. I was unsettled by how clearly I could see the shape of what had almost happened. My father hadn't planned this out of malice. He had looked at the situation the same way he always did, as a family unit with shared resources, and Mallory as the most reliable part of the structure. He genuinely believed I would agree. The problem was that he believed it so completely that he didn't think asking was necessary. And I had spent years quietly confirming that belief every time I went along with something, without requiring a real conversation. I was done confirming it. 12 days after I stood on my parents' back steps, my office phone rang during the lunch hour. My assistant transferred the call, flagging it as business-related. A man from a regional SBA lending office introduced himself pleasantly and thanked me for my family's cooperation with the loan application. He said he only needed to verify a few property details before the underwriting team could finalize their review. For 3 full seconds, I thought I had misunderstood. Then I asked him to send me every document connected to my name or the property address before we discussed anything further. He agreed without hesitation. The email arrived within the hour. There was a letter. My father had written it on his personal stationery, The kind with his name printed in small block letters at the top, that he used for anything he considered formal correspondence. In it, he described the duplex as a family investment, stated that both he and my mother fully supported the use of their ownership interest as part of the loan collateral, and noted that all family members with a connection to the property were in agreement with the application. He had included my name in that letter. I had never been asked. I had never agreed. My name appeared in a document submitted to a federal lending program without a single conversation with me. I saved the entire email thread, printed a copy, and forwarded everything to Pauline with one sentence. Please send the buyout letter this week. Then I closed my office door and sat for a few minutes without doing anything, not from anger exactly, more from the particular sadness of having something you suspected confirmed in print. I called my father that evening. I told him I had received a call from the SBA lender that afternoon. I told him I had seen the letter he submitted. I kept my voice steady, and I said what needed to be said plainly. My name was in a document I had never authorized, and I was formally beginning the process of buying out his and my mother's ownership share of the duplex, so that my home could no longer be used as leverage for something I had no part in deciding. There was a pause on the line. Then his voice shifted into a firmness I recognized from childhood. Not anger, but certainty. He said this was family. He said the duplex had come from family money. He said Seth needed this opportunity, and that I had more than enough, and that I was making something simple into something unnecessarily complicated. I told him that helping family should always be a choice. Assuming someone will agree is not the same as asking them. He didn't have an answer for that. He said he needed to think, and the call ended. My mother called the next morning. She took a softer approach. She talked about how detailed Seth's business proposal was this time, how much work he had put into it, how she genuinely believed things would be different. She reminded me of sacrifices relatives had made for each other over the years, stories I had grown up hearing. She was gentle, but the message underneath was the same. I was choosing my finances over my brother's future. I let her finish before I responded. I told her I loved her. I told her I wasn't choosing against Seth. I was simply declining to agree to a decision I was never invited to make. Seth called that same afternoon. He sounded genuinely confused, which somehow hurt more than anything my parents had said. He told me he'd had no idea there was a problem. He said our father had told him the property piece was already handled, that I would see the logic of it once the application was further along and would go along without any issue. He said you'd never actually say no, Seth told me. That wasn't something you did. That sentence stayed with me for a long time. Not because Seth meant it as a cruelty, he was just repeating what he'd been told, but because it showed me something I hadn't fully confronted before. My years of being agreeable hadn't just made my family comfortable around me. It had convinced them, somewhere along the way, that my agreement was automatic. That asking me was a formality, not a real question. That refusal wasn't something I was actually capable of. I told Seth I was sorry things had been presented to him the way they had. I told him I hoped his restaurant idea was strong enough to stand on its own, because I genuinely did want it to work out, but I could not allow my home to be pledged as collateral for a business I had no ownership in and no ability to influence. There was no version of that arrangement that was fair to ask for. He didn't argue. He said he understood or was trying to. The formal buyout letter went out the following week by certified mail. Pauline had calculated a fair market purchase price of $23,400 for my parents' share, based on the current appraisal and their proportional contribution to the original purchase. The letter was precise and respectful. It included a draft quitclaim deed and a response deadline. At the same time, Pauline sent a formal notice to the SBA lender on my behalf. The letter stated clearly that I had not authorized the use of my name or property in any loan application, that the information submitted by another party did not reflect my consent, and that the title was currently subject to an active transfer process. The lender was asked to pause any further review until resolution. The loan review stopped. My parents asked for an in-person meeting. I agreed to one, on the condition that it take place in Pauline's conference room, rather than at the family home. I wasn't trying to be cold about it. I had simply spent enough years watching disputes unfold to know that environment shapes conversation. Family kitchens are for emotional appeals. Conference rooms are for making decisions that hold. My father came in looking like he expected to negotiate. He sat down across from Pauline and me, and started with a version of the same argument he had made on the phone. that the property had started with family money, that Seth deserved this chance, that I was being too rigid about something that didn't have to be this formal. Pauline let him finish. Then she opened the file and walked through the buyout offer line by line. The numbers were fair. The calculation was transparent. The $18,000 my parents had contributed in 2017 had grown with the property's appreciation over 7 years, and the buyout reflected that honestly. They were not being cheated out of anything. They were being paid fair market value for their share. My father stared at the paper for a long time. Then he looked at me. I think he expected to find something negotiable in my expression, some familiar flicker of guilt that he could work with. I wasn't angry at him, but I wasn't uncertain either, and he could see that those were two different things. My mother asked if there was any other structure that might work. Pauline explained quietly that any alternative arrangement would require my full and documented consent at each step, which I was not prepared to give. They signed the buyout agreement before they left the conference room. 3 weeks later, after the transfer funds cleared and the quitclaim deed was recorded with the county, the duplex was in my name alone for the first time since I had bought it. I wired my parents the $23,400 the same afternoon the deed recorded. I didn't want any version of this where anyone could honestly say I had taken something from them. I paid fair value for my own peace of mind, cleanly and completely. Whatever complicated feelings existed between us, the financial record would be straightforward. Seth applied for a microloan through a local community development lender about 2 months later. A smaller amount, built around his own credit history and the restaurant's projected revenue. His business partner agreed to co-sign. As far as I know, the application is still moving through the process. I hope it clears. I hope the restaurant opens and finds its footing and becomes the thing that finally sticks for him. I have meant that every time I have said it, and I still mean it now. I just wasn't willing to stake my home on whether it would. Things with my father are quieter, not cold. We still talk on Sunday afternoons, same as we always have, but careful. There's a new space in those conversations, something we navigate around without naming it. He has never apologized for putting my name in that letter. I stopped waiting for it sometime around the 3rd month. Some people express regret with words. Others signal that a lesson was received by simply never repeating what they did. My father is the second kind. That's not absolution, but after enough time it becomes something I can live with. My mother still believes I made things harder than they needed to be. We had a long phone call in the fall where I tried to explain it, one more time, what consent actually means between people who love each other, why the size of a favor doesn't change whether permission is required to ask for it. She listened. She didn't exactly disagree. She said she understood, and then she moved on to other things. I decided to let it rest there. What I keep returning to when I think about all of it is the line Seth gave me without realizing what he was handing over. He said, "You'd never actually say no. That wasn't something you did." That's not a description of a generous person. That's a description of someone who has been made to feel that saying no isn't safe. And I had spent years, honestly, more than a decade, making it feel safer for everyone around me to assume than to ask. Not out of weakness, out of the habit of being the person who held things steady. But at some point, those two things had merged into something I didn't fully recognize until I was standing on the back steps of my childhood home, listening to my future being arranged without my voice in the room. Responsible people get counted on. That's not a bad thing by itself. But when responsibility becomes predictability, and predictability becomes assumption, something important disappears. The people who love you most can start treating your agreement as a given. And by the time you notice it happening, you've been consenting to things you were never actually asked about. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't send angry messages or pull relatives into the middle of it. I made one legal decision with the help of someone I trusted. I held that line through every uncomfortable phone call that followed, and I paid a fair price for clarity. The deed is in my name. The mortgage is current. My tenant downstairs just renewed her lease for another year. Every decision about this property, what to fix, whether to refinance, who has any claim to it, begins and ends with me. I didn't understand how much I had been living without that until the day I finally had it back.